Tonight I'll be talking about my most recent book, which is about the subject of road ecology. And for the uninitiated, road ecology is this relatively small, but I would say very fast-growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways that roads interact with and influence nature, and I think really importantly what we do to manage those interactions, which of course are so negative for wildlife oftentimes. And roads are so transformative to nature, upon nature, in large part because there are just so many of them, right? We have something like 4 million miles of road here in the US, by far the largest road network of any country. There are around 40 million miles of road globally, and about 15 million miles more of paved road alone, to say nothing of unpaved road, that will be built by the middle of this century. We're in this period called the infrastructure tsunami, as some ecologists have dubbed it, this wave of new construction that's sweeping the planet. We've got a lot of roads out there, and we're building more all the time. And I think in part because roads are so ubiquitous, we don't really think about them very much, right? We use them every day. They're kind of the backdrop to our lives, and they're fundamentally useful. You know, they're how we get to hospitals and grocery stores and schools and trailheads and all the birding expeditions and all the places we like to get to. And of course, roads have this powerful cultural valence in the U.S. as well. They're these powerful symbols of human freedom and mobility and momentum that Bruce Springsteen sings about and Jack Kerouac wrote about. But the tragic irony of roads is that for all of the freedom and mobility and momentum that they're providing us humans, they're denying other species at a truly unfathomable scale. And the most conspicuous way they do that, of course, is through roadkill, right? Direct mortality. And sometimes when I give talks in person, you know, I'll sort of poll the audience and say, hey, how many vertebrate animals, we're not talking about, you know, insects and arachnids here, just vertebrate animals, do you think are killed by cars every day in the US? And people say, well, you know, maybe 10,000 or 100,000 on the high end. But in fact, more than 1 million vertebrates are killed by cars every day, including something like 300 million birds. You know, it's up there with, I mean, certainly doesn't compare to windows or cats, but, you know, after those two sources of mortality, it's probably the largest source of direct mortality for birds. And, you know, I think in part because logically enough, you know, the most visible animals that we kill and see along the highway are the most common ones. You know, I think we have this way of maybe subconsciously dismissing roadkill as a conservation crisis, right? I think maybe we say, you know, we hit a lot of white-tailed deer and a lot of raccoons and opossums, and that's, you know, that's sad for those raccoons and opossums, but there are plenty of raccoons out there. But in fact, there are dozens of federally threatened and endangered species, from Florida panthers to ocelots to tiger salamanders, for which roadkill is the primary source of mortality. We know we're in the middle of this sixth mass extinction event in planetary history. And as Richard Foreman, one of the founders of the discipline of road ecology, has pointed out, roads are the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality, right? Which is just a fancy way of saying there's literally nothing that we do that kills more animals than drive. And I think that one of the things that makes roadkill so pernicious as a conservation crisis is the way that it subverts and really hijacks evolution, right? You think about the defense mechanisms of so many common in beloved species, you know, from skunks who spray to porcupines who bristle their quills to turtles who withdraw into their shells, right? These are kind of these stand your ground defense mechanisms that worked really well, you know, for thousands of generations against wolves and cougars and other natural predators. But when your predator is a pickup truck, you know, barreling down the Taconic at 70 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is withdraw into your shell, right? So the weight and speed of modern automobiles takes evolution and actually renders it maladaptive. I find that tragic to contemplate. So again, roadkill is the most obvious way that roads and nature interact, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And road ecologists are engaged in examining all of these other connections between our transportation infrastructure and natural ecosystems as well. Roads are vectors of invasive species, right? We've all seen dandelions lining every highway in New York. We know that plants and non-native plants and animals enter ecosystems essentially along a grid. One of the places I went working on this book was Montana. Uh, and I visited these old logging roads where for many years logging trucks had transported the seeds of invasive thistles in the treads of their tires, and then all of those thistles kind of bloom at once, and you get this eerie linear purple stripe running across the landscape. Roads are zones of erosion. Here's a pop quiz for you. Who's the single largest road manager on Earth? It's actually the U.S. Forest Service, which has something like 400,000 miles of road on public lands in the U.S. The vast majority of those are old dirt logging roads, right? So they're not, busy interstate highways. They're not getting a whole lot of traffic. But you get a big rain event or a snow melt event, and those dirt roads just turn liquid, and all of that sediment runs off into streams and impacts downstream water quality and smothers fish eggs and amphibian larvae and creates all kinds of problems. So roads, even little trafficked roads, can be these geological and hydrological forces that dramatically change the landscape. Roads are sources of pollution. Our cars are constantly bleeding cadmium and zinc and copper and microplastics and all kinds of stuff into the environment. And we're learning more all the time about just what impacts all of this chemical contamination has. A few years ago, researchers at the University of Washington, did a bunch of studies and realized that many years of coho salmon die-offs in the Puget Sound watershed were being caused by 6-PPD, which is an obscure chemical that's added to tires as an ozone protection agent. And something like 6 million tons of tire particles go into the environment every year, and we're causing these huge fish die-offs. And that's the only place that this has been studied, right? I mean, who knows what that chemical is doing to shad or alewives in New York, but certainly nothing good. One of those chemical interactions that roads induce is road salt, right? We add something like 20 million tons of road salt to our highways every year as a de-icing agent. And that salt has enormous impacts. Of course, all that salt has to go somewhere, and it runs off into aquatic ecosystems with huge effects on everything from phytoplankton to trout. It also turns our highways into salt licks, right? Animals are attracted to salt. They need salt. And so, you get these really dangerous situations where deer and other critters basically line highways, licking that salt and potentially getting involved in crashes. I will say that the road salt issue inspired my favorite road sign. You can see this in Jasper National Park in Canada every winter. They've got a flashing sign that says, "Do not let moose lick your car." I'm not sure you could stop a moose from licking a car. I think if a moose wants to lick a car, he's probably going to do it. But that's the sort of weird, novel interaction that roads create. Roads are these hellscapes of noise, right? The constant grumble of engines and tires has huge impacts both on human public health in terms of elevating our cortisol levels and blood pressures and risks of stroke and cardiac disease and other problems, and also on ecosystems, right? You're all birders. You understand that birds in particular live in this really sensitive acoustic environment, and if you're a western meadowlark out here in Colorado where I live, singing to attract a mate, and your mate can't hear you over the noise of engines and tires, you can't live in that place, right? So in that sense, road noise is actually this profound form of habitat loss. Or imagine being an owl who has to listen to the crunch of a rodent's feet in the leaf litter. Again, that's an incredibly subtle acoustic signal that's very easily drowned out by traffic. And here I just wanted to show one quick video that I think illustrates this concept of road noise as habitat loss. It's not necessarily an intuitive one. So you've got this lovely bucolic scene, bears wandering through a forest somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And then did you all hear that? That engine noise comes in, and those bears instantly turn on high alert and flee the area, right? And I think importantly, there was no actual physical vehicle in this scenario. Researchers just played the noise of an engine through speakers in the forest. So there was no road here. There was no there was no car. But that acoustic pollution is enough to drive those animals away. But it's not all doom and gloom necessarily, right? Yes, roads destroy ecosystems, but they also create ecosystems in a sense. We know that animals are endlessly creative and adaptive and flexible, and they're really good at taking advantage of these novel habitats that we engineer for them. One of the places I went working on this book was Minnesota, and I visited this highway bridge, and on the underside of the bridge were all of these crevices filled with hundreds of roosting little brown bats, taking advantage of that novel habitat that we'd built for them. Another example of roads as habitat are roadsides, right? In many states, especially in the Midwest, so much of the landscape is corn and soy monoculture, and the only uh, strips of remnant prairie are those roadsides, right? Anne mentioned going out and butterfly watching, monarch watching. Well, there's something like 17 million acres of monarch habitat on roadsides, and around 500 million stems of milkweed out there for them. These days the monarch butterfly migration through the Midwest basically follows I-35 from Minnesota to Texas. So there's a potential advantage there, or at least a benefit for pollinators, but it's also a really dangerous ecosystem, really dangerous resource, right? And we're luring animals to the roadside with these pollinator friendly plants, and then potentially killing them. And millions of monarch butterflies are killed every year. By cars. We don't really think about insects as being roadkill, but this is a huge source of mortality. So we always have to be asking ourselves, with our roads, are we creating more opportunities for pollinators than we're costing them in terms of road mortality? There are trade-offs there. And I think those same trade-offs apply to scavenging birds as well, right? We've all seen, a raven or a magpie or a bald eagle, perched atop a carcass by the side of the road. Here in Colorado, right, we've got golden eagles, who feed really readily on roadkill. And again, there's a potential opportunity there for those animals. But it's a very dangerous opportunity. If you're an eagle with a belly full of venison, it takes you a minute to achieve liftoff, and you're at risk of being hit by a car yourself. And in fact, thousands of eagles are killed by cars every year. It's a really significant source of mortality. And there are things we can do to mitigate those risks. There's a great study by Hawkwatch International that I talk about in the book, where they basically found that if you just take those carcasses and drag them 40 feet off the road, that's far enough that those scavenging birds can basically feed in peace and not be hit by cars and not flush every time a truck goes by. So we can take those carcasses and make them a more valuable resource for those scavengers potentially, and kind of redeem the tragedy of roadkill in the process. So, of course, it's not just eagles and turtles and other animals who are in jeopardy, when vehicles and wildlife collide. It's also us drivers as well, right? In New York and Westchester County, especially, I'm sure everybody here has had the experience of hitting or nearly hitting a deer. I know that driving the sawmill is always kind of a gauntlet for sure, especially at night, and it's really hard to overstate, I think, just how frequent and problematic those large animal crashes, those wildlife vehicle collisions really are. They're up to 2 million. large animal crashes in the U.S. every year. Most of those with white-tailed deer. That's something like a crash every 30 seconds. There's a deer collision every 8 minutes. In the state of New York. And these days, the average deer collision costs society more than $9,000 in hospital bills, vehicle repairs, insurance costs, tow trucks, and so on. Out here in Colorado, we've got elk. Average elk collision costs more than $20,000. Average moose collision costs more than $40,000. And collectively, these large animal crashes are costing society more than $10 billion with a B every single year. And there are also more than 400 drivers killed in white-tailed deer collisions, which makes white-tailed deer the single most dangerous wild animal in North America. Obviously, it's not the deer's fault, right? It's automotive society's fault, but I think that just goes to show, how frequent and dangerous these crashes are. So historically, the way that transportation departments like NISDOT have tried to address this issue is with this thing, right? The iconic, yellow diamond with the leaping black buck. And I'll just tell you empirically what I bet you deduced intuitively, which is that these things do not work at all, right? They're just kind of scattered randomly across the landscape, rather than put up in any kind of systematic way. Generally, often you see this sort of thing, deer crossing next 30 miles, and like what driver is going to remain alert with her foot on the brake for 30 miles? The animals don't know to cross at the signs, which is really frustrating, right? So I've heard, some biologists call animal signs litter on sticks. I think gets at their uselessness nicely. And I'd point out too that from wildlife's perspective, even if signs did reduce collisions, collisions are only part of the problem that roads create, right? And in some cases, I think the bigger problem is actually the barrier effect. This wall of moving vehicles that's cruising along so many of our busy highways and preventing animals from navigating the landscape altogether, right? Imagine standing on the shoulder of, the New York Thruway, I-87, trying to find a gap in traffic to run through. You just never could, right? And so in that sense, our freeways are basically these walls preventing animals from navigating the landscape and inducing this habitat fragmentation that's really problematic. And one of the places I went working on this book was southwestern Wyoming to kind of illustrate this phenomenon. And there's this herd of mule deer, close related species to white-tailed deer, and scientists have been putting collars on these mule deer for many years, satellite collars, trying to figure out exactly where they go and where they hang out. And what they found is that the deer very clearly never cross I-80, right, the big interstate highway running across the country, including through Wyoming. And during harsh winters, those deer will basically pool up on the north side of the interstate, looking for a gap in traffic, an opportunity to cross to find that better forage to the south during these harsh, snowy Wyoming winters. And they just never managed to find an opportunity to cross, right? The traffic is just too constant, too dense. And so during those really rough winters, 40% of that deer herd will actually starve because they can't access those seasonal resources. And again, I think that's probably a bigger problem than roadkill itself, right? A herd of 1,000 deer could handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that habitat. Here's another map that illustrates the same phenomenon or a similar phenomenon. These are the movements of a single young male bear in Montana. That white line is I-90, and every red X is a place where that bear approached the highway and bounced off like a ping pong ball, just repelled by that constant wall of traffic. So that bear attempted more than 40 crossings before he finally found his way across the highway a year later. And a lot of these examples are Western, just because that's where this issue has been best studied, I would say. But I've also seen this for black bears and for bobcats and roosters along the New York freeway. In the Hudson Valley, like
Oh, okay. Okay.
a national problem. Uh,
We're getting some feedback from someone's microphone.
Ah,
thanks, Ken.
All right.
Here's yet another depressing map. I kind of love. I don't say love, but I'm fascinated by these sorts of wildlife movement maps. These are mountain lion locations in Southern California, just outside of Los Angeles. Very famous population of mountain lions in the southern Santa Monica Mountains near LA. This is the population that P22, probably the most famous wild animal on Earth for a few years there, came from. So if you know P22, you know these animals. Those red lines are the freeways, right? The 101, the 405, busiest freeways on Earth. And what you can see very clearly is that those mountain lions never cross those freeways, right? They're basically trapped in this little island of habitat in this ocean of traffic. And as a result, they can't disperse out to find unrelated animals to mate with. And so there have been individual male mountain lions who have mated with their own daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters. They've become incredibly inbred over time. They're suffering genetic defects, and they've entered what some scientists have called an extinction vortex, this long-term doom spiral caused by traffic fragmentation. So we've got these two linked problems, right? We've got wildlife vehicle collisions, these animal crashes that are killing lots of critters and are also really dangerous and expensive for us drivers. And we've got this habitat fragmentation problem, right? The fact that because of our busy freeways, animals can't move around the landscape and do the things they need to do. So how do we address those two linked problems? And really the best tool at our disposal are wildlife crossings, right? Overpasses, underpasses, culverts, all of these different structures that basically let animals safely move around ecosystems. And this idea of building dedicated infrastructure for wildlife really begins in Western Europe in the 1950s. France built the first wildlife crossings, followed by Germany and Switzerland and Austria and other Western European countries. These days, the Netherlands are the world's leaders in wildlife crossings. They have the most sort of per kilometer of road. The Dutch are just famously great engineers at everything they do, right? This is a famous Dutch overpass that crosses 2 lanes of traffic, a railroad track, a sports complex, and a business park. It's a kilometer long, so pretty incredible and inspiring structure. In North America, the place that wildlife crossings really became most famous and renowned is in Banff National Park in Canada. These are crossings I bet some of you anybody who's been to Banff has seen these things, and I'm sure that people here have. So in Banff, Banff, like many quote unquote protected areas, has a highway, the Trans-Canada Highway, running right through the middle of it. So in the 1980s, Banff started building wildlife underpasses and overpasses. They built around 40 crossings altogether. The underpasses, primarily got used by deer and herbivores, but those overpasses were really for grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are they really have a strong preference for overpasses. They're these, big, powerful animals who kind of want to confront their enemies head on out in the open. They don't want to be like slinking through a box culvert, whereas, black bears in a state like New York are pretty willing underpass users. Grizzlies really need those overpasses. So Banff built 6 of those overpasses. They did many years of research. And what they figured out very clearly was that that those overpasses were sufficient to kind of heal that fragmentation, those genetic divides that we see, for example, in Southern California with mountain lions, that bears were crossing the highway, they were mating on either side. The sows would take their cubs across, and their cubs would become crossers themselves, and then the cubs would teach their cubs. So there's this kind of incredible intergenerational learning process that happened around these wildlife crossings, and so those Banff crossings and the research that came out of them proved hugely influential. Here in the US, the first wildlife crossings were built in the 1970s, almost entirely in western states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado. And the reason for that is that, out here in the West, our wildlife tends to be migratory. We have these harsh seasonal landscapes, and animals are walking long distances, often in large numbers, between their summer and winter habitats. So if you get 1,000 mule deer crossing a highway in Wyoming, the same place year after year, pretty soon there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put a wildlife crossing right here, right? So those Western migratory ungulates are pretty straightforward animals to address this way. Whereas, in the East, it just kind of feels like white-tailed deer are everywhere all the time, right? There aren't, predictable seasonal migrations. They don't really move around in herds, and there aren't like discrete roadkill hotspots in the same way. And so historically, I think Eastern states kind of threw their hands up and said, it's fine for you guys in Wyoming to do this, but here in New York or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for us. That's starting to change, fortunately, and we'll talk about that in a second. I think a really important lesson that road ecologists learned very quickly when they started building wildlife crossings was the importance of fencing, right? People always say, how do the animals know to use the crossings? And the answer is the fences make them, right? You fence off that roadside, and that deer is trying to find a place to cross. She hits that fence line. She walks the fence line for a quarter mile, and then hey, here's this nice box culvert, just inviting her to cross right there. Right. So those two elements, the fencing and the crossings, really work hand in hand. Right. The fencing keeps the animals off the highway and prevents roadkill, and funnels the animals to the passages, and then the passages provide for that habitat connectivity that we know is so important. So you can't really have one without the other. Another important lesson is the importance of providing a diversity of crossing opportunities, right? Some animals like going under, some animals like going over, some animals, use riparian corridors, some animals, use uplands or forests. Every animal fills its own kind of ecological niche, and they also have their own sort of crossing niche. So a couple of nice examples of that. Here's a wildlife overpass on I-90 near Seattle, up at a place called Snoqualmie Pass, very famous wildlife overpass. And the overpass was built primarily for elk. Elk tend to be animals who like going over rather than under, although they will do both. But in this ecosystem, of course, there were other animals too, right? There were mustelids, weasels, and rodents and lizards and western toads and all kinds of smaller critters as well. And those smaller animals, they don't want to walk across the wide open deck of a bridge, right? If you're a vole trying to cross a bridge, you're just going to get picked off by a hawk. So what they did here was they bolted in all of these log structures that you can see to provide some cover so that those smaller animals can kind of hopscotch between those different habitat elements. So just thinking about the whole system, I think, is really important. Another example of that, again, near Seattle on I-90, another nice kind of open underpass. Note that they divided the highway so that light could hit the floor of that underpass and just create a much more welcoming, natural, inviting vibe for critters. You can also see that line of rocks through the back of the underpass there, and that's for those reptiles who use rock structures, as well as pikas, little sort of rabbit cousins who are talus animals. So again, just thinking about that whole system. And then, one more nice crossing from that same area is this, big expanded box culvert, right? So they tore out, one of those narrow corrugated metal pipes, put in, a much larger culvert along stream crossing, and that lets those riparian or aquatic animals, the otters, the beavers, the salamanders, have a place to cross as well. So again, just thinking about that whole system, I think, is so important. So I wanted to take a minute to just talk about culverts for a second, because they end up being really important for wildlife. And culverts, of course, are any pipe that funnel water under a roadway, right? They're not necessarily built for animals. But animals again are creative and flexible and smart, and they'll figure out, hey, let's walk through this pipe rather than across the 4-lane highway, and that's probably safer. So these are already kind of de facto wildlife crossings in many cases, and there are things we can do to make them better. So here's an example of that. This is a crossing under Highway 93 in Montana, where this culvert got used by skunks and bobcats and all kinds of mid-sized mammals. But in spring, water would rise and there would be a few inches of standing water at the bottom of the culvert, and those animals didn't want to get their paws wet. So what the DOT did was they put in what they call a critter shelf, that metal catwalk that runs through the culvert, so that animals can use that culvert year-round without getting wet. So that provides for year-round passage. And actually, NYSDOT, New York DOT, did a bunch of these in the Adirondacks. You can see I think a couple dozen of them up in the Dacks, which is cool. So not every wildlife crossing has to be a big $20 million overpass, right? I know that's what we think of when we think about wildlife crossings, but there's so much we can do, with cheap tweaks and retrofits to use the existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape. And here's another example of that. I mentioned earlier that historically, eastern states, haven't been nearly as proactive about wildlife crossings as western ones, but that's starting to change. And one of the places where that's changing is Virginia, which has done some really important research into white-tailed deer mitigation. And in Virginia, they've got I-64. Big whitetail collision area. But I-64 has these culverts going underneath them. Again, these are not wildlife crossings originally. These are built for the movement of water and livestock and other purposes. But what the DOT realized is, hey, if we just fence off this roadside, we can basically funnel animals to these culverts and make them use them as wildlife crossings, right? So that's what they did. They installed, some fencing on either side of some of these culverts, just to funnel animals to those crossing points. They saw more than a 90% reduction in collisions and deer collisions as a result. A 4-fold increase in deer usage of those passages, right? You're just guiding deer to the places you want them to cross under the highway rather than across it. And I think probably most relevant for the DOT is this project actually recovered its own costs in under 2 years, right? We were talking earlier about how dangerous and expensive these large animal crashes are. And if you can put in fencing and crossings that prevent, dozens of them a year, as many of these projects do, you can save the public a lot of money very quickly. And I think that's a really important point about wildlife crossings that people sometimes miss is they're great conservation investments, but they're also really good financial investments. There's a little bit of sticker shock associated with them at the start sometimes. Really, we're going to spend, $20 million helping black bears cross a highway. That sounds kind of crazy. But there are so many cases in the peer-reviewed literature of these projects penciling out financially in a very short period of time. Here's an overpass, multi-million-dollar structure not too far from me in Colorado on Mule Deer Winter Range, that paid for its own construction costs in something like 5 years, right? So again, yes, good conservation policy, also good fiscal policy. Of course, the caveat to that is that if we just build wildlife crossings for those large, dangerous, expensive animals that we don't want to hit, there are a lot of critters that we leave out, right? And that's generally what's happened in the U.S. We've built lots of crossings for deer and moose and elk and bears, and very few for salamanders, frogs, toads, turtles, snakes, right? Because nobody's ever totaled their car hitting a northern red-legged frog. But we know those amphibians are some of the most road-endangered animals on Earth, right? They're undertaking these migrations themselves from their upland forest habitat to their wetland breeding habitat, and of course, roads run between those habitats, and so you get these massive squishing events on those warm, wet spring nights that we've all seen. And we've got options for these guys. The amphibians will very readily use a wildlife crossing. Here's an amphibian culvert built largely for spotted salamanders in Moncton, Vermont. Really cool, famous project. There was just a study that came out last week finding that this culvert reduced amphibian squishings by 80%, which was really exciting. Long Island just built a frog tunnel, which was pretty cool. I forget what town, but that was one of the sort of the first examples out there. So we know how this is, again, a problem we know how to solve. It's just a matter of kind of summoning the political will to do something about these smaller critters as well as the larger ones. And of course, we just need a lot more wildlife crossings out there on the landscape. I mentioned earlier that there are those famous mountain lions in Southern California who've become fragmented and inbred and are at risk of extinction. Well, as many of you probably know, there's a wildlife crossing being built for those guys right now that will be completed next year. It's the biggest wildlife overpass in North America. It crosses 10 lanes of traffic and 300,000 cars a day. So if we can put a wildlife crossing, over the 101 in LA, the most famous car city on earth, right? We can put one over I-87 or over the Taconic. I'll also point out this is really a global movement, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from other countries about how to protect wildlife from roads. Here's one neat example of that. This is a famous overpass for red crabs on Christmas Island, and they've got this huge red crab migration, millions of crabs going from the rainforest down to the beach to spawn, just like amphibians in a sense, in North America. And they built these incredible crab overpasses, these steel bridges that the crabs use in gigantic numbers, right? So it is possible to protect these, smaller animals as well as the larger ones. Another neat thing when you travel, especially to tropical countries, are canopy bridges, right? There are lots of arboreal animals out there, animals who are fragmented, trapped in their little forest fragments, probably won't descend to the forest floor to use a conventional underpass. But if you can connect those forest fragments with rope bridges and ladders at the level of the treetops, you can provide connectivity for those animals as well. So you see, these canopy crossings for primates in Brazil and sloths in Costa Rica and squirrel gliders in Australia. And, we've got arboreal animals too, right? I mean, a flying squirrel or a fisher or a porcupine would certainly use one of these things. We just, haven't done it. Another sort of neat intervention that you see in India are these sort of open floor plans, essentially, right? India is a country that is building out a lot of infrastructure right now, building new highways through national parks and tiger sanctuaries. And obviously that's, not what you want. But, what they've done in several cases is basically elevated those highways on these concrete pillars, right? That basically lift up, the highway off the forest floor. And instead of having a small isolated underpass, now the whole forest floor is wide open for animals to move back and forth. And obviously that dramatically increased construction costs, which is part of why we don't do it. But, it's the kind of thing you can do when you're building out your infrastructure from scratch. And we see some neat legal innovations out there for protecting wildlife. One of the places I went working on this book was Brazil. And Brazil, another country that's building highways very quickly. Of course, the most biodiverse country on Earth. And tapirs and capybaras and giant anteaters and all of these animals are at risk. But Brazil has lots of underpasses and fencing. And one of the reasons for that is that they've got this cool legal framework where basically if you hit a capybara or a tapir and damage your car, you can actually hold the road operator liable for those costs on the grounds that the road operator should have installed underpasses and fencing, right? This is a problem we know how to solve. And just like it's the road operator's obligation to fill the potholes, it should be their obligation to prevent roadkill. So, I like the way that Brazil takes the usual logic of roadkill and inverts it. It's not a driver behavioral problem. It's really an infrastructural problem that we know how to solve and should be solving. So, here in the US, we're entering I don't want to say a golden age because that probably overstates it, but we're certainly making progress on wildlife crossings. The 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law included something called the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program, this big $350 million pot of money that states and native tribes and other groups could apply to get to build wildlife crossings. And New York actually got a bit of that money. Most of that funding has gone to Western states. Like Colorado, Montana, Utah, California, states that have done a lot of this work before and have lots of shovel-ready wildlife crossings to build. But other states like New York and Pennsylvania and, Connecticut have gotten sort of smaller chunks of money to basically do some planning, to figure out where we need wildlife crossings and, what spots we should prioritize. As Ken mentioned, the state did try to pass a bill, did pass a bill that, would have brought some of its own, or not even brought its own money to the table, just kind of aided in that process and encouraged the state to go after more of this federal funding. Hochul vetoed it. So that's not great. But nevertheless, New York does have the promise of, of more wildlife crossings on the horizon, thanks to some of this federal money. So this briefly, this Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program basically expires this year, and we're hoping to see it reauthorized in 2026 as part of a big surface transportation bill, and ideally we'd see it reauthorized at $500 million instead of $350. These projects are only getting more expensive. Obviously, tough political climate for this issue, but it is really a nonpartisan issue that has support on both sides of the aisle. So fingers crossed that this Wildlife Crossings pilot program that has given out so much money and been really successful gets continued. Another federal program that I think is worth highlighting is an aquatic organism passage program. The infrastructure law included $1 billion with a B for culverts. New culverts on anadromous or ocean-going fish-bearing streams, and a lot of that funding went to Western states with Pacific salmon issues like Oregon, Washington, California, Alaska, but Eastern states like Massachusetts and Virginia, and I think New York, New Jersey certainly got funding as well to put in some fish-friendly culverts. So certainly this is not just a terrestrial issue; it's an aquatic one as well. So ultimately, both the opportunity and the challenge before us is to remake our infrastructure to save biodiversity, right? No pressure. But again, we know we're in the middle of this mass extinction event, and that roads are the leading cause of that. And if we're going to save wildlife on this planet in the 21st century, we have to deal with the impacts of our roads. So here's one example of that. This is an underpass for ocelots in Texas, and Texas has about 100 ocelots left. And roadkill is 40% of ocelot mortality, right? It's a species we're losing right now because it can't cross roads safely. And of course, dealing with our roads is also profoundly important for human health and safety and flourishing. Roads impact us in really analogous ways to the ways they impact wildlife. Obviously, 40,000 Americans are killed in car crashes every year. The air pollution and the noise pollution from vehicles is hugely negative. Roads are also these profound forms of social change and engineering. This is an overhead shot of Syracuse, as some of you probably recognized, which has I-81 running through the middle of it. And I-81 was built in the 1950s and 60s very intentionally through Syracuse's largest Black community and displaced thousands of families. And to this day, Syracuse is one of the most segregated cities in the country because that sun-blotting viaduct just cuts off white and Black neighborhoods. Happily, there's a plan that's already being implemented to tear down that viaduct and replace it with an at-grade boulevard that will have housing and small businesses and other community elements. So our infrastructural mistakes don't have to be permanent. There's still time to change the way our built environment looks and functions. So with that, I'll say thank you again all so much for having me. If this conversation just piques your interest in this topic, I do have this newish book out on the subject. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both seem to really like it. So there's, liberals and conservatives united around the niche cause of habitat connectivity. And I say that somewhat facetiously, but truly, this is a nonpartisan issue here in Colorado. 85% of residents support more wildlife crossings. Polling suggests that it's the same in other states as well. This is one of those rare issues that truly unites the Humane Society and the hunting lobby. So hopefully we can find some consensus around this topic in a hyper polarized world.